Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to today's event with Cristina Groeger, discussing her book, The Education Trap, Schools and the Remaking of Inequality in Boston, in conversation with Nick Juravich. Today's event is part of Harvard Bookstore's Friday Forum series, which takes place on Friday afternoons during the academic year as a way to highlight scholarly books in a wide range of fields. Though we remain digital for the time being, we have a full schedule of virtual events in the coming weeks as part of this afternoon series and others, so do check out our website for our complete event calendar. For today's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of The Education Trap. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. And lastly, as you may know if you've participated in large virtual gatherings lately, which I assume most of you already have, technical issues might come up. We do apologize in advance for that. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Cristina Groeger is an assistant professor of history at Lake Forest College. Her research on education, work, and the deepening structures of inequality in the United States has received funding from the National Academy of Education and the Spencer Foundation. Her writing and public scholarship have been featured widely in venues including the New England Quarterly, the Journal of Urban History, and as part of the People's History Walking Tour of Boston, which I encourage everyone to check out if able. Today, she will be joined in conversation by Nick Juravich, Assistant Professor of History and Labor Studies and the Associate Director of the Labor Resource Center at UMass Boston. His research, which primarily grapples with the complex histories of labor and social movements in the United States, has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the National Academy of Education, among others. He is the author of the forthcoming book, The Work of Education, Community-Based Educators in Schools, Freedom Struggles, and the Labor Movement. Today, they'll be discussing Cristina's book, The Education Trap, a compelling and critically insightful analysis of the United States' paradoxical relationship with education that author Seamus Khan calls exquisite, a work that compels social scientists, historians, and the public to rethink our vision of how to achieve a more equitable society. Focusing on turn-of-the-century Boston, where Gilded Age inequity gave rise to unprecedented increases in public school funding and support, Groeger fearlessly traces the negative consequences of this social reform. In the US, where we continue to nurture the firmly held assumption that education is always a pathway to equality, the education trap is an essential and timely reminder, especially during this critical time when we have been forced to interrogate the classroom and its benefits, that even our most trusted institutions reinforce social inequality, and that a more equitable society can only come from grander fights for justice. We are so thrilled to be hosting this event this afternoon. Without further ado, I'm now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Cristina and Nick.
So, Ben, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. It's really fun to see friends in the attendees list, even though it's we can't see your faces. And I am so extremely excited to be able to talk to Tina about this book. I have it here, of course. And while I want to get to Tina actually talking about it, I wanted to say just three things in sort of introducing it. I've already had the privilege of teaching this book this spring in a class on working class Boston. And in addition to being a really important intervention in sort of the scholarship on work and education and statecraft, in this era, but also, as you heard in Seamus Khan's comment on it, our own. This is a wonderful book for teaching. It is full of rich stories, rich insights. We'll talk about sort of the research and the data on it. And I think, you know, insofar as this is a book that's going to excite scholars and teachers, it's also a book that is really urgently sort of making us think about our present, about how institutions shape inequality, about what schools are for. And so I have so enjoyed reading it and teaching it already, and I can't wait to do it again. And I think after hearing Tina talk about it, you all will be just as excited as I am if you aren't already. So having said that, by way of a brief, excited intro, Tina, tell us how you wrote this amazing book.
Yes, well, thank you, Nick, for that intro. And thank you to everybody who's here, to Harvard Bookstore for hosting. And yeah, this is an exciting moment, the launch of the book. So I'll just say a little bit about how I came to the topic. Really, I think the earliest inklings of this project were reading John Dewey as an undergraduate, and just really being interested and thinking through the notion that schools are kind of the basis of transforming society in a much larger way. And particularly for Dewey, this was about making the economy more democratic. So not just creating sort of political democracy, but also thinking about how to create an economic democracy. And so the questions of how education and social inequality were related to each other kind of started at that moment. But of course, Dewey was writing in the early 20th century, and we know that inequality has not, his vision didn't really pan out the way he imagined. And we have rising levels of educational attainment, but also today, the US has one of the highest levels of inequality in history. So my question kind of starting graduate school and starting this project was, why does his vision of education not work? What's going on historically? And that led me to a much kind of more expansive history of political economy and how education fits into it. And really what I found was at every step of the way in the shaping of kind of our modern corporate economy, the educational system sort of grew up with it, and was sort of always, these two things were kind of mutually constitutive. And so the inequalities in our economic system became part of our educational system as well.
And so to start where the book starts, it's so hard, I think, today sometimes to imagine that education is for something besides the acquisition of individual skills to carry out into the market and get you a job and accumulate wealth. But of course, in the moment you start, one, that's not how most people get jobs, and two, that's not necessarily how education is conceived. So tell us about that starting moment.
Yeah, well, and this is, I think, one of the advantages of and sort of exciting aspects of doing historical research is that you can, really challenges. Today we kind of take the role of education and the prevalence of schooling for granted in, the life stages of most people. In 19th century Boston, most people had, up to an 8th grade education, but after that, people would find work through informal networks, family networks, or ethnic networks, and they would learn their work on the job, right? You would learn the skills relevant to your workplace, either in a more formalized apprenticeship if you were a craft worker, or really just like an informal, most types of work were learned kind of through an informal apprenticeship, working alongside a practitioner. And schools, kind of secondary education, colleges and universities that existed were primarily for a tiny, elite. But I argue that even for elites, they're sort of one among multiple sites of elite formation. They don't have the same kind of monopoly, or they're not essential for the formation of elites. There are a lot of other cultural, social institutions that elites are using to kind of reproduce themselves. And even for professions that we imagine today, the learned professions of teaching, of being a lawyer, a doctor, most lawyers and doctors did not attend a professional school. They still would have learned their work alongside a practitioner in kind of an informal model.
And so what starts to change then as we get into this period, this sort of progressive era that both sort of reformers, elite reformers primarily, but also working people start to seek out school as a way to sort of shape the working world?
Yeah, so I'm going to share a chart from the book. So the big driver of change in this period is what's going on with sort of a new white collar workforce. So this is a period, kind of the rise of new mass production industries, large scale industries, corporate bureaucracies, and there are new forms of work, kind of the paperwork that fuels some of these large scale bureaucracies. So accountants and bookkeepers and secretaries and sales workers. And we can see that the change is much more dramatic for women. Women are kind of a major player in shaping this transformation. But by 1940, clerical and sales work for men becomes 20% of the workforce, the largest sector. And for women, it's almost 40%. It really rises dramatically. And this sort of sector of work depends and also fuels new types of training that offer these students access to these jobs. And first on the scene, we have kind of this whole sector of schools that I had no idea about before I started this project, but they're called business colleges or commercial colleges. They're essentially the for-profits of the 19th, early 20th century. And they offer training, in penmanship, in typing, in bookkeeping that isn't really well offered by public schools at this point or other institutions. And they can offer, they're fee charging, but they're fairly inexpensive. And they offer these short courses to students, a lot of women, a lot of second generation immigrants that wouldn't have been able to get a job, didn't have the family networks to go and work with, an accountant or with a business owner. But by going to these schools, they can access these skills and enter this new workforce. And because of the success of these schools, there's a broad coalition that advocates for free alternatives to this form of training in the public sector. And this leads to what's called the high school movement, the rise essentially of the public high school. I see as really being driven by this new workforce, but also kind of a reaction to what a lot of reformers think is an exploitative private sector of these business colleges. So public high schools expand, and I find that it's mainly, this is just showing women's enrollment, but it's mainly these commercial courses, business courses that are the real drivers. And I think for this sort of story is also the basis of the ideology of education as a means of achieving the American dream, right? Like for these, women that look like this, this becomes using schools to access this form of work is a success story, like a story of social mobility. And I think that what's happening in this sector plays a really important role in solidifying that ideology, because in this case, it's really based in lived experience and reality.
I love those graphs, and I want to talk more about how you made them in a moment. And I think I talked about this book as a book to teach, and they were so valuable in teaching this book. But I wanted to ask you first to talk about the transformation of the economy and the corporatization of the economy, to help us understand too how a sort of space is opened up for social mobility for these workers who go into these new white collar professions, at the same time that conflict rages about who will do machine work in factories, about craft union training, and about sort of the shape of the economy overall.
Yeah, so I think like this sort of white collar story is the success story. It's a story that most closely matches the economics kind of human capital model of you get skills, you get a better paying job. But this is sort of just one slice of transformations in this era. And another really important shift that's kind of the flip side of what's happening in white collar work is what's happening in the industrial sector. So for craft workers, basically training becomes one of the key areas of conflict between craft unions and employers. And that's because craft union power depends on maintaining a monopoly essentially of skills, of control of access to these craft worker positions, and control of the apprenticeship process. And at the same time that white collar work is expanding, you see a lot of efforts of employers of craft workers to try to find cheaper forms of training so they can avoid, a union regulated apprenticeship. And there are all these efforts to start industrial education. And still, like, when we think of vocational education today, I think there's still this sense of like, it's men's industrial education is kind of the dominant way that we think about it, or apprenticeships for construction work or things like that. But I argue that actually that, dating back to the 19th century, really is not a very successful form of training. It never really meets employers' training needs. And that's because craft workers are one of the only sectors of work in this period that have some organized power, and craft unions are actually able to limit the success of, or sometimes even shut down, private trade schools, which they see as kind of breeding grounds for strike breakers. And they can shape public industrial education to limit the way that or limit its ability to directly usurp the role of apprenticeship. So in response, employers try to find other ways of undercutting craft workers and craft worker unions. And one of these is through the pursuit of large mass production industries that can shift the entire workforce away from craft workers and onto, on the one hand, kind of immigrant operators that are operatives that can be trained very quickly. And of course, new white collar staff, right? That becomes a new kind of composition of the workforce. So this sort of reveals like this dual-sided or two sides of the coin of this white collar transformation. For these women, this is real social mobility. This is a success story. For employers, the shift to white collar work is also a very effective way of undercutting one of the few sectors of work that has organized power, right, of undercutting craft workers and relying on a new labor force that is half as expensive as men, and kind of contingent, right? There's almost no labor unions in the white collar workforce. This is a field that has very little power as opposed to craft workers. So that's kind of one of the key dynamics. And another that I will mention is what happens at the top of the economic hierarchy, kind of in reaction to the explosion of high school enrollment, new demographics, right? New kinds of populations entering white collar work. We see this reaction of elites to try to maintain their control over the top paying positions in the economy, and especially in sort of new corporate management positions, corporate law. And that is achieved through kind of forging new ties with colleges and universities, which in Boston at this point are exclusively private. And we see sort of the marriage of college credentials and a new corporate upper class in preserving the power of the elite in reaction to this kind of broader transformation of the economy.
So in a way, the creation of new paths to work in the high school drive the creation of a kind of credentialism. As you said, wasn't as essential to sort of elite status in the 19th century, in this early 20th century moment. I also, this is, maybe a moment to nerd out a little, but I do think one thing about this book that for me is so exciting is you take these long-running debates in the history of education and really help us rethink them. So this question of, is education for sort of democratic mobility, or is it in fact a part of this sort of system of capitalist sorting and sort of how people interact? What I think is so rich about this project is you're able to show us, right, at different levels and different scales, here are people taking advantage, taking advantage of courses that are available privately, publicly, using them to advance themselves. And yet here's how, as a system, we develop not just sort of new structures of inequality, but new ideologies that sort of legitimate that inequality. And since you wrote the book, you can say this better than me, so I haven't asked a question, but I wonder if you wanted to say more on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we see, I want to show kind of how these like contradictory or seemingly contradictory factors and dynamics are at play at the same time. So it's not, education can be a way of achieving social mobility at the individual level, but if we don't, we'll come back to kind of the education trap idea, but if we don't look at this, the broader context and how, you know, with every, creating this credentials race at every new step, elites are kind of able to control access to the top. We don't see the full picture of what educational expansion, of the consequences of educational expansion.
And so this is a question I've also really been excited to ask you. So thinking about how we see that full picture, one thing that makes this book so fascinating is, as you say in the introduction, you're using full 100% samples of the US Census through IPUMS, the Integrated Public Use Microdata Series, I believe is what that stands for. So this is a history book that relies on really in-depth, serious, extensive quantitative analysis. And historians are constantly being told we need to do more of this. And sometimes that's couched in very, I think, sort of surface terms that we'll all be taken more seriously if we act like economists. But your book actually shows us what deep engagement with quantitative sources can do. So can you tell us a little about how you did that work, but also how it shaped your analysis and your understanding of these phenomena?
Yeah, so I think quantitative data methods have been on the rise in history departments in recent years and maybe the last 10 years. But yeah, when I was in grad school starting this project, very few historians that I talked to knew much about these sources, knew about quantitative data, and most of the information I got was from the economists on my committee, or I worked with Claudia Golden. And I remember her reaction, sort of like, what do you mean you don't know like what IPUMS is, or you don't know these, you know, how to use the census historically, because this is sort of the bread and butter of a lot of social sciences for many decades at least. And so I wanted to show just what this data looks like. So yeah, as Nick was saying, this is kind of complete. Well, IPUMS creates census samples from the digitized manuscript censuses, but in the last couple years, they've put out 100% samples. So basically the entire census and individual level from the census is now entirely digitized. And it just opens up, you know, if you have that fine grained level of detail, it opens up a lot of possibilities for being able to dig down, you know, very specifically and see trends that, you know, a 1% sample or a smaller number wouldn't really allow you to do. So, I mean, you've seen some of the charts already. I use this data for getting a sense of occupational trends, of school enrollment. I'll just give one example here that was surprising to me, and I don't think I wouldn't have been able to find it without this data. So this shows school attendance and rising school attendance of the children of low-wage workers. So kind of the children with working class backgrounds in Boston in this period. And as you can see, you know, all of these groups are rising, like school enrollment is rising for everyone. But throughout this period, the enrollment rates of African Americans were higher, I mean, significantly higher than native-born whites and also whites born in Ireland. So this was, you know, I didn't know this before doing this project, and this was a really important, or this, I think this what this chart kind of captures is also one of the kind of pokes this hole in the ideology of education, right? So even though African Americans are getting higher rates of education throughout this period than other working class whites, they, you know, their story, I'll go back, their story does not look like what's happening with this group of women, right? Like African Americans are consistently, they don't have access to these white collar positions other than a very tiny number of Black owned businesses, but basically they are kept out of the labor market. So even though, you know, certain populations are able to use their education to access better paying jobs, no matter how much education African Americans got, that was not their story. They were really marginalized in the labor market. So having this kind of data can really highlight or put a point on some of these divergent experiences depending on what groups we're looking at.
Well, and I think what you just said tees up the kind of question we'd imagined for, sort of wrapping up this portion of talking about the book, which is the title. So when I first encountered this project, it was Paths to Work, which of course makes tons of sense. Like that was your dissertation title. The Education Trap, it's a powerful, it's a provocative title. What is this as an analytic frame, and sort of as you've completed this project, as you wrap up both chronologically, but also thinking about sort of having written this book, how should we think about education as a trap, or the education trap?
Yeah, so it's the basic idea is that it's really targeted at kind of the ideology of education, and just the notion that education is a panacea, that it's like the policy tool that we should use to reduce inequality, to address all other, many other kinds of social problems. And I think it has, that ideology is rooted in this earlier period, but we still see it promoted all over the place today. And I think there's a lot of danger in that kind of argument. One, because it obscures sort of some of these other consequences of educational expansion historically that we've seen. And it's a very convenient policy tool, I think, for some of the most powerful organized interests in the economy. So, employers are very happy to have education be the solution to economic problems because it takes the burden of reform off of them, or even attention on them, and basically puts the burden of reform onto individuals to improve their skill level. So, you don't have a well-paying job, well, get some new training, develop the skills that will allow you to enter the workplace or get paid better. That kind of argument is very individualizing and kind of puts the burden onto the most marginalized, or kind of those with the least economic power. And I think the historical narrative that I want to tell also really pushes back on the dominant narrative that comes out of the field of economics, but I think has kind of, we still see it all over the place, which is if only more people had access to education and could improve their skills, then they would be able to enter the fastest, or not the fastest growing, but the highest paying jobs in the economy that economists see as expanding because of technological change, and specifically skill bias technological change. So like technological change favors highly skilled workplaces and workers. If you get these skills, then you can access those jobs. And in the economist frame, this will reduce inequality because it'll sort of put, if you flood the market with lots of educated workers at the top, it'll kind of put downward pressure on wages at the top. But we've seen how elites are very good at creating new barriers to entry at those top positions. So in theory, this might, supply demand story might work, but in practice, I think more education without other ways of kind of rebalancing or giving workers more power in the economy will just sort of fuel this credentials race. If it's not a high school diploma or a college degree, it'll be a master's degree as a new barrier of entry to the top positions. So I think in those different ways, I think we need to sort of rethink some of these basic assumptions, a lot in coming out of economics and this human capital model that I think don't really recognize the role of power in the economy appropriately.
Well, and just even as you spoke right there at the end about sort of the credentials race, when my students at UMass Boston read this, their immediate connection, and you make this connection, of course, yourself, and the conclusion was to student debt today, and sort of this new form of an education trap. You need the credential, but at what cost can you acquire that credential? And so I'm sure we'll have some of these questions from our attendees, but I want to ask, as you think about sort of this as a frame for the present, what comes out of this research when you look around, especially in our pandemic moment, at the sort of debate about what schools are for and how they should serve individual students, but also communities of students. What are you thinking about when you sort of reflect on this moment through this work?
Yeah, so on the issue of student debt, I mean, this was the period that I'm looking at. Tuition, even at private universities, was like a few hundred, $20, right? We didn't have the same kinds of like overwhelming debt in private education or public education. But I think one of the dynamics that I talked about a little bit before is this sort of relationship between the public and the private sector. And we see how for-profit schools, they're on the scene first, and some of them are really offering kinds of opportunities that were not available otherwise. But there's also a lot of room for exploitation. And we see this movement for free public high schools as sort of the most effective way of displacing a potentially exploitative private sector. So I think it's, to me, it seems sort of like a no-brainer to apply that lesson to today, right? Like we should have, to the extent that education is really important on an individual level for opening up opportunities, like it should be a free resource. We should have debt-free and tuition-free college for anyone who wants it. And that actually has been a working class demand and a labor union demand since the 19th century, not just for free high school education, but also for free universities. So I would say like one lesson is like this should be a free resource. However, I think also that's not going to be enough because these educational solutions, again, like they don't address the lack of power that workers have in the economy. They don't address like the question of, well, what jobs are students actually going to go into after they graduate? And if we don't think about those labor questions, no amount of education is going to solve them. And for this sort of education trap reasons, it could also exacerbate some of the problems with kind of elites, again, being able to control access to the top positions in the economy.
And this is, I know we're going to have more questions on that when we open up. I have one final one before we shift gears to hearing from our group, which was, and this is perhaps again a sort of thinking about the history scholarship, but there's this story we tell about inequality, I think, and I'm a historian of the recent past, that's the rise and fall of the New Deal order. And of course, the New Deal order itself is often described as being rooted in part in the post-war era in the radical expansion of what was then often free or very inexpensive public higher ed. And you ask us to rethink that in a couple of ways. And I think, looking at your book now, it feels urgent for all the reasons you just said, but also as we're thinking about the sort of trajectory of our present in light of this work, what are some of the continuities you see there?
So I'll show you a chart that should probably be familiar to many of you that look at inequality, but history of inequality in the United States in one graph or chart. And I think, right, because of where we are today with inequality, with kind of one of the highest rates of inequality in history, rightfully so, a lot of explanations of inequality look to what's happened in the 1970s and 1980s, right, when inequality began to go up again. But one, I want to say we can actually learn a lot from going back to a much earlier time period where we see inequality rising in the early 20th century, even though, between, this data doesn't go back earlier, but between 1900 and 1920, this is the high school movement. This is sort of the era where education was expanding, public education was expanding at one of the highest rates. So we can learn a lot from this period in thinking about how education and inequality interacted with each other. The other, I guess, what you were referring to in the New Deal order, this what happens in the middle of the 20th century when inequality goes down. This is also where I think I'm mostly challenging dominant narratives from the field of economics. But one of the big stories in economic history is that a big part of this expansion, or sorry, a big part of this reduction in inequality was the mass expansion of not public high schools, but public college education and federal policies like the GI Bill that offered opportunities for students to go to college for free. That sort of led to this fall in inequality. And I think what I would argue is, based on what we know from the early 20th century, that the rise of education can only be a partial explanation, and I would argue is not kind of the primary explanation of what's going on in these years. I think the primary factors are really, we have to look at, again, the balance of power in the economy and how much power workers have. And in the middle of the 20th century, although craft unions had been, really wiped out in the period that I'm looking at, we see this huge expansion of industrial unions. So unions that are not organized around exclusive skills, but organized across skill level, across genders and races. And organized labor reaches new heights in this period and becomes kind of the political basis for new federal welfare programs, for progressive taxation. And those are some of the key factors that lead to this decline in inequality. And so now, education has been expanding in the United States throughout this period. Now what we're seeing are, since the 1970s, a lot of these forms of power that workers developed have been eroded. Unionization rates are at an all-time low, but education is still expanding. So I think we can kind of rethink, we need to focus on the role of workers in the economy and how much power they have in conjunction with education to really understand and be able to explain these trends in inequality.
Tina, thank you so much. This is where we would applaud you if we were all in person and raise a glass. But for those who are in the audience attending, we would love to take some questions. I see there are at least 2 already. Let me pull these up. So we have 2. These are both great questions, actually. So I like this one. So I think you do talk about this in the book. We'll start with the first question asked here. A history, either anecdotal or more widespread, of workers throughout Boston rejecting white-collar credentialism around the time of this grand shift, or challenging it or offering alternatives to it, for that matter.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think there are lots of critiques of the educational system early on, and before it kind of before there's this, I think, more widespread support. But one of the critiques of high schools by craft workers in early periods is like, this is just training, for mercantile profit seeking, for kind of training a new owner, training new business owners, training a new managerial class, and it's not actually, it's going to be antithetical to the interests of organized labor. And that we see the sort of critique of schools as being elitist, I think, from a number of different sides. There's also, I think, a critique from business owners who think that education that college education, for instance, is also, right, it's teaching a classical curriculum that doesn't have anything to do with the real world, that it's not practical enough. And I think schools in places where there aren't, organized interests opposing new trends, we can explain a lot of their dynamics based on, new labor market demands. So I think the rise of public high schools is responding to an overwhelming support from a lot of different groups, but I think we do see critiques all throughout from multiple sides of this new system that's developing.
And one thing I wanted to chime in on, because I really loved reading this and working with my students on it, was that in your second chapter, Uplifting the Unskilled, you talk about this sort of early evolution of sort of not even really industrial education so much as sort of education that was meant to simultaneously train people to be better domestic servants and better, sort of low-wage workers, and also to, by doing so, uplift and add dignity to. And this was a sort of very well-intentioned sort of settlement house progressive era intervention, mostly in sort of private/nonprofit context. And the story you tell of the workers is great because they vote with their feet. Right? They just don't go.
Yeah, no, I guess I didn't talk too much about that, but I think that this ideology that, like, if you only give people more skills, that is going to allow them, that's not just going to elevate their wages, but is actually going to kind of professionalize their occupation. So like the reason that domestic servants aren't paid well is because they lack skills. So if you open a school of housekeeping, this is going to change, professionalize that occupation. I think it reflects some of the dynamics that are happening at the top of the economic hierarchy, where you could interpret what's going on as, oh, if you just increase, right, if you just add a degree program, that will professionalize a field like law. They're sort of applying that to an occupation like domestic service, and it doesn't work because, yeah, students don't want to go. But I think that is also kind of one of an early human capital approach to thinking about education, that you can sort of solve all of these labor market solutions through skills, when in a lot of cases, it like very clearly does not work.
And actually, as a follow-up on this line of thinking, there's some other questions we'll come back to, but Eric Baker's just asked a great follow-up question about sort of management intellectuals and their visions for worker education in this moment. Many people, I'm sure, think of Taylorism, and then maybe a few decades later, a decade or two later, Henry Ford and his Americanization schools. But yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think this is, employers are really eager to use education for all kinds of, to solve all kinds of problems. And we see new Americanization programs, often in conjunction with the public school system, but employers are very eager for their immigrant workers to take citizenship classes, to take English language learning classes. So they sometimes host these forms of education in their establishments. But I think and also forms of industrial education, like even private trade schools that they would fund, or even new sort of company schools that they would house inside. But I think what ends up happening is that employers find that it's cheaper and easier for them to rely on external institutions, especially public schools, to kind of take over their training needs for them. So they really outsource, I think, a lot of this training. And right, they can rely now on colleges and universities for their management needs, and they don't need to pay for it, although they support these institutions. And these institutions, I think, because of the ties that are developed between them, they essentially become, they're doing the training that employers would have wanted anyway. But it puts a lot of what they sometimes developed outside of the formal school system back into the school system as the school system changes.
Yeah. So we've got questions coming in. I want to jump back to one that came in earlier. So a question about job scarcity and how that's constructed. And I really like this question because, of course, that's one that students are confronted with in the present as a logic for spending all that money on school and accumulating student debt to sort of escape that scarcity problem. So how might we think about this then and now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in recent years, we're seeing what's sometimes called the hollowing out of the economy, or the polarization of the economy, where middle class, well-paying unionized jobs in manufacturing has, disappeared. And what we're seeing are kind of some jobs at the very top, that are well paying, but kind of a small sector of the economy, and then a growing service sector at the bottom that are often paid low wages. And I think here's where, although for any individual today, like, the college premium, the benefit that students get from attending college and having higher credentials, like there's no denying that college credentials matter more than ever, because they have become so important as a way of accessing the top positions. But I think we need to kind of reckon with the fact that if we don't think about how to actually expand the number of well-paying jobs, the number of middle-class jobs kind of throughout the economy, then what we're doing is basically just sending a larger and larger number of people into kind of a shrinking sector of the economy, or more competition for a small number of jobs, that then elites can erect new barriers of entry, to keep it at this small level. So I think thinking through, yes, education should be free, but also what are ways of building the power of workers, of supporting new organizing efforts, new ways of improving and bringing back well-paying jobs. That's going to happen kind of outside of the school system.
You're reminding me of my pitch for why students should major in labor studies, which is, you might not be able to get you a great job in the existing market, but we'll teach you how to unionize whichever job you get.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, and it's not quite that simple, but there's a point there. So I'm seeing our friend Noah Rosenblum has asked a great question about the Deweyan educational vision. And to me, it relates to this question that Lou asks right in the follow-up. So Noah's asking about, what do we make of the Deweyan vision now? Were they just capitalism's useful idiots? A great question. And then Lou asks us, is there hope, or do we see or hope to see a return to maybe something that resembles that Deweyan vision? So maybe we can take both those together.
Yeah, I mean, I think even Dewey himself like tempered some of his optimism by the 1930s. So, just I think seeing entrenched power structures in the economy as really difficult to change through an educational model. But I think it's not. I think that even as you were saying, if we think about the question of building worker power as, in some sense, an educational issue, or we can think about, like, what are the kinds of practices and skills that might actually help workers, that might empower workers and help them build power. I think there are, organizing experiences or participating in protest movements that many of my students are now. Like, these are all experiences that that might happen in a formal educational setting or might happen outside of it, but they're still forms of education that could really reshape the economy in the long run. And in some ways that's a little bit Deweyan, in the sense that, right, he also, it's like learning by doing. You have these experiences that can then translate into broader change down the road. I think that would still apply to just, maybe not within the formal educational system as it's structured now, but still be, we can still think about that role of education for how do you have important experience learning, how do you learn the skills of organizing or of building power. And the question about, well, what could education be? I mean, I think once, if we can address, like right now, students are understandably focused on the sort of the vocational function of education, in the sense that, like, for many of them, this is what they need to do to get a better job, and like rightfully so, like this is an important concern for them. So I think we sort of first have to address that piece, but if we can actually, you know, create a society with well-paying jobs, I think that would alleviate the educational system from having to have that role. And we could, you know, rethink, what do we want education to actually be for? And it might open up a lot of other possibilities for rethinking what, you know, what forms of knowledge or what kinds of experiences and practices that we might want to have in a society. And that would be a kind of freeing notion, but I think that sort of can't happen unless we address this other piece first.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So Christopher Green just asked a great question that I feel like you started to answer in a way there, because it's, you know, these experiences of organizing, which so many students have had in the last year, and also of encountering, you know, a very sort of naked and violent version of you know, neglect on the job from their employer or from the state, and maybe that's their employer in some cases. But I also appreciate the question about sort of, are there directions where we might see inequality cemented or increased? And of course, that's already come up in the context of everything from school reopening to access to broadband internet and technology, and also space to work. So I think there's a lot in this question, and I'd love to hear you say more on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Chris is also asking kind of what are more hopeful directions maybe that I see or that we might go in. And I think, I mean, what we've been seeing now and in recent years with organizing among educators and teacher unions, and like I'm in Chicago right now. I think the Chicago Teachers Union has for a number of years kind of been leading new efforts to not just fight for the sort of labor rights of teachers, as if we're thinking about this as a workplace issue, just, you know, a large sector of the workforce, right, who are educators are organizing. So they're fighting for the labor rights of those workers, but they're also using their contract negotiations to push for more progressive policies in the city as a whole. So advocating for resources for their schools and for their students that would improve student learning conditions, in addition to making teaching, you know, a livable profession. And I think across a number of service sector or public facing service sector jobs, we've seen new organizing efforts. And I think those offer, those are kind of exciting new directions, I think, that we can follow. And in Chicago, at least, the CTU is really pushing forward like this broader progressive vision in the city, and leading kind of policy at the local level in a very powerful way. And I think you know, students therefore are getting new kinds of experiences because they see their teachers organizing, and students are also leading their own protest movements against police violence or any other number of things. So those, I think, are some of the ways that we see kind of glimmers of hope and maybe some change on the horizon, that is focused more squarely on dealing with the sort of lack of power of workers on the job.
I feel I have to chime in from the other side of things here in Boston, where BTU are likewise led by a social justice caucus since 2016, 2017, and have, you know, I think one thing that a lot of people, both in the teacher union movement and watching it, we're really worried about and have seen in some elements take place during this pandemic is, of course, that classic pitting teachers against students. Teachers are impediments to reopening, they're impediments to, you know, actually solving the problem. But of course, I think when you look at CTU and you look at BTU, the level of investment they've made over the last several years in these communities has made it very hard for administrators to cynically make those arguments, because people know that these teachers have been there for their communities. They've been working on everything from ethnic studies curricula here in Boston to creating new positions in the contract for social workers, for school nurses, that allow, have actually, I think, allowed sometimes these schools to address remote learning in the pandemic more fully. So there's such an immense conflict that's been sort of created by, I think, by some of the administrative decisions right now, but the degree to which CTU, BTU, others have been able to show us what sort of on the ground work yields in the face of that kind of threat has been really inspiring. I'm rambling and I shouldn't take time from our final questions. So we have two here. I think these are both good broad questions to end on. One is a question about anything that surprised you, and another is a question about future research. So maybe let's take those together as our way to wrap up.
Yes. So what types of future research? I mean, I think it's funny in some ways that, like, part of the takeaway of my argument is, like, we should shift our focus away from education and onto labor history, or onto, the history of capitalism, or thinking about the political economy more broadly. So in some ways, I think, in terms of, I think I'm interested in kind of all of these questions, and I think the questions of how we value different kinds of skills, is not just something that that you can do from within the field of education, but is also kind of a question of labor and political economy. I think it's frustrating because I think there are so many assumptions in economics that are still so dominant, even though they have been debunked in a lot of research. So I think in some ways this, it might not be research that we need, and now, more organizing, more kind of political action, because I think we know a lot of the limitations, I think, at this point of the literature. But I think those are sort of some of the areas that we need to focus attention on, either as scholars, but also, I think, as residents of our communities, as those who take part in politics, in really thinking about how can we defend the value of the kinds of work that we want to preserve and want to continue, and how do we sort of push back on some of these narratives that blame workers, or sort of just see the problem as one of lack of skills.
It struck me as you were talking about economists that perhaps you're saying it's not the individual merit of their arguments that gives them power, but their position in the economy of knowledge, which is, I think, a very education trap point. So it's 1 o'clock. Again, we should be applauding you and raising a glass, but in lieu of that, thank you so much to Harvard Bookstore for hosting us. Thank you, Tina, so much for writing this book. Thank you all for coming, read it, teach it, share it. And I think Harvard will close us out here, but thank you all for making time for us on a Saturday.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, and thank you both once again for this fantastic conversation. It's such a great way to spend part of a Friday afternoon talking about this. So thanks. And thanks to you all for spending part of your afternoon with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase The Education Trap at harvard.com. I've put the link to purchase in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Mass., enjoy your weekend, keep reading, and stay safe, everyone. Enjoy the weather. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.